Negotiation happens at all levels of life and politics, from more individual decision-making like buying a car or asking for a raise, to high politics like confronting North Korea's nuclear program, resolving the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, and striking multilateral trade agreements. Negotiation has developed significantly as an academic field over the last few decades. What do we know, and what else have we yet to explore? Today we're pleased to have Dr. Bob Mnookin, the Samuel Williston Professor of Law at Harvard Law School, the chair of its program on negotiation, and the director of the Harvard Negotiation Research Project. This year, Bob has written 2 books. The first is a co-author of Kissinger, the Negotiator, Lessons from Dealmaking at the Highest Level, and second, The Jewish-American Paradox, Embracing Choice in a Changing World. Bob, thank you so much for joining.
Pleasure to be here.
Now, my first question is, seriously, what were you thinking writing 2 books in a single year?
Well, first of all, it took me much more than a single year. The Kissinger book, Nick Burns and I worked with Jim Sabinius, and Jim was really the primary author of that book, although we obviously were deeply involved. That book is part of a broader project in which we're interviewing all the living secretaries of state about their most important negotiations. That book arose out of this project because after we interviewed Kissinger, Jim had the idea, why don't we in fact write a book about what the most important lessons that might be derived from Kissinger's remarkable experience as a negotiator. The Jewish-American Paradox is a strange book for me to have written in the following sense. I'm not a Jewish studies guy.
You're a law professor.
I'm a law professor, exactly. And like you, I grew up in Kansas City.
Wonderful place.
Great place, and I hope we can talk about that. And one of my daughters, like the children of many of my friends, intermarried with our complete blessing. And so I have a grandchild, believe it or not, named Cornelius Alcott VI. Now, needless to say, we call him Eli. Yeah. Father and grandfather and great-grandfather and grandmothers were not raised as Jews. And part of me realized that I really hoped that he'd grow up to have a Jewish identity. And I asked myself, what's that all about? Why, as someone who's not religiously observant, did I have these rather deep feelings? And so this book is part memoir, but also explores what I see as the challenges facing the American community.
I'm really excited to talk about both of these books. But before we get to that, I wanted to talk a little bit about negotiation as a field. I mean, you were part of its development, its start really academically in a serious sense in several decades ago. What have been some of the greatest revelations in the field, in the interdisciplinary study of negotiation?
Well, what's marvelous about negotiation is today it's both taught and seriously studied in universities. When I went to Harvard Law School, there were no courses on negotiation. As an undergraduate here at Harvard College, I was very influenced by a course I took from Thomas Schelling, because I'm an economics major and very interested in strategic interaction. All kinds of disciplines have studied negotiations, history, political science, to name a couple conspicuous ones. And lawyers negotiate all the time, whether it's deal-making on the one hand or conflict resolution on the other. But it's really only in the last 30 or 40 years that within universities it's been taken seriously as a field, and in the professional schools particularly, it's now taught. I know you're at the Kennedy School. There are negotiation courses at the Kennedy School, as there are at the business school and the law school.
So the greatest developments are that it is just considered now a field in its own right, whereas before it was kind of a side project, or what was it?
Well, I think that in fact there weren't many people before who were specializing in it. It's inherently interdisciplinary, and I say that because it involves extremely complicated behavior, and there's no single model that captures it all. Yeah. I mean, what I love about the field is that game theory and strategic interaction is important. Other aspects of economics dealing with principal-agent problems are relevant, and all sorts of psychology is extremely relevant. Social psychology, cognitive psychology, how people think about and evaluate risk, all of this is relevant.
Do you have a favorite fact or tactic of negotiation, or something that you just love that you discovered over the course of the last several decades?
I don't have a favorite tactic at all, but I mean, what I've really devoted much of my career to is trying to think through conceptually, how do you best describe and explain the challenges of negotiation? And my own view is that negotiation requires the management of certain tensions that are quite inherent in the process. I've also studied, which was begun at the time I was at Stanford, with economists and psychologists, the various barriers to negotiation. I've been particularly interested in the question, why under circumstances when parties could make themselves better off through a negotiated resolution, do negotiations fail? And once again, a variety of disciplines can give you insight into that.
Is there something that you're surprised that humans still do, or that continue to do, that increase the likelihood of that failure?
I think, I'm not sure surprise is the right word, but let me explain one of the three tensions that I think is at the core of a lot of negotiations. I'm very committed to the notion that through negotiation, parties can often expand the pie. They can make deals that create efficiency. Many people go into negotiations thinking it's a zero-sum game. What you win, I lose. What I win, you lose. When we're teaching negotiation at the law school, for example, we beat up on them pretty unmercifully because we want them to understand that it's often possible to make deals where the pie is expanded. On the other hand, other people think that if people would just be nice to each other, if you behave decently, distributive issues disappear. You and I could start a partnership where, because we have complementary skills, we can create a lot more valuable together in our partnership than we could separately. Nonetheless, we're still going to have the issue of how are we going to divide the profits.
Right. So the slice of the pie matters.
Slicing the pie matters.
But also you can make it bigger.
But you can make it better and bigger.
That's the tension.
And that is exactly the tension. And the tension flows from the fact that to create value, you often want to communicate a great deal about your underlying interests and resources. Mm-hmm. But if you are naive about how you do that, you can get exploited with respect to the distributive aspect of a bargain. I can give you a simple example. Yeah. One example that's often used in negotiation to explain why it's important to disclose your interests is a story about two brothers fighting about an orange. They fight over the orange. They both want the whole orange. They finally, in disgust, agree to cut it in half. After they cut it in half, their relationship, by the way, has now been completely spoiled by the fight.
Well, oranges do that.
Oranges do that. Apples as well. One brother takes the orange, walks away from his brother, scoops out the fruit, eats the fruit, throws the peel away. Mm-hmm. The other brother goes home, scoops out the fruit, throws it down the garbage disposal, and takes the skin, the peel, and thinly slices it to flavor some kind of
Grand Marnier tort.
Exactly. And obviously, that's a very inefficient outcome. They resolved it, but they could have done it in a more better way. Therefore, the message is, you should have shared what your underlying interests were, why you wanted it. On the other hand, I can tell a second story. If you and I are on a desert island,
Great.
I've got an apple orchard, you've got an orange grove.
Sounds pretty good.
And I say to you, I think we ought to trade some of my apples for your oranges. We both could be better off. You say to me, I'm all ears. And I say, well, the truth is, I've got all these apples. Apples give me a stomachache. I don't like them, but I love oranges. Now, in terms of the terms of trade, you may offer me one of your oranges for all of my apples.
Because you're not going to have them. So I might as well try and get as many.
But I've been exploited in terms of the distributive aspect because I disclose too much.
Well, I would never do that to you on a desert island.
I'm sure you wouldn't.
But no, so that gets at that tension.
That's right.
And it's great because in honor of pies, I baked you an apple pie. A real apple pie.
Fantastic.
Crust was made this morning. Baked it this morning. I've been working on it since last night. Shall we?
Sure.
Okay. How big is? Are you a? So this is a pretty deep pie. So I got to warn you, I don't know what your...
A small slice will do me fine.
There, is that good?
That looks perfect. Now I understand you learned how to make this in Kansas City.
I made this yes. So there's a good story. Ice cream?
Sure.
So,
just a little bit. That's great.
So one of my parents befriended this Italian family, the D'Agostino's. And the matriarch of the family, she used to cook incidentally for 11 children. And we were really we kind of integrated with their family. We used to go to their house for Christmas. We're not Catholic, but we used to do it. And we used to go over to their house for all sorts of events.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to call her Nana. Nana used to make the best blueberry pies. So much so that I liked them so much I asked her when I was like 13. I was like, Nana, I would just love to learn how to make this on my own because I would like to make more pies than you. She used to give them to us frequently, but I wanted to just, take it into overdrive. And so I started learning pies. A year later, 2 years later, sadly, she passed away.
Oh, goodness.
So it's sort of
You're carrying on the tradition.
I'm carrying on the tradition, although there are 40 cousins who are also carrying on the tradition. I met. She had a very large, it was a very, very big family. But yeah, they're some of our closest friends back in Kansas City, and so this is something that I took.
Well, it gives me a huge kick that we share the same high school.
Yeah, well, it's amazing because had we gone to the same high school in Cambridge or something, I think that would be fine. All right, kind of cool. But this is first Kansas City.
It's Kansas City.
Yeah. So this is Pembroke Hill. Here you go. And so what was that like for you?
Well, when I went to Pem, it was called Pem Day
Right.
then, Pembroke Country Day.
Yeah.
There were about 43 guys in my class. It was all boys.
Mm-hmm.
All boys. I started in 8th grade, and the quality of the education was superb.
Mm-hmm.
My class of 40, I think, had 9 or 10 national merit semifinalists, and indeed, the cross-section of kids in my class was extremely able.
Yeah.
And very nice.
Did that impact your past negotiation at all? Because were you like the one mediating conflict between the bully in the class and the one who was picked on?
I don't think. That's an interesting question. Looking back, I think I've always been interested in trying to understand different sides of an argument or a conflict. Yeah. So in that sense, temperamentally, I sort of have a mediator's temperament. Mm-hmm. And I think, by the way, effective negotiators, I think a critical skill is being able to understand the other person's perspective, being a good listener.
Not just listening. I mean, this is the second tension that you mentioned. You mentioned there are 3 tensions. We
right.
talked about the first. Second tension, if I recall, is empathy versus assertiveness.
Exactly
and empathy
right.
is...
And you want to have both.
You want to have both. Because
both.
if you're too empathetic, you could also be, you both could be exploited, or you also just might lose your way.
You could fall into accommodation.
I see.
You see, some people, for example, mm-hmm. it's very important to be able to understand the other person's perspective.
Right.
Some people, when they're in conflict with someone, they understand the other person's perspective. They can't hold on to their own interests any longer. They fall into accommodation mode.
So so you gotta keep in mind, you gotta stick to your guns somehow, while understanding and empathizing. I wonder if this is this a version? I mean, seems to be related to why like foreign service officers mm-hmm. only spend 3 years or 2 to 3 years in a country, because if they spend much longer than that, they will develop more of a. I mean, it's long enough to kind of get a sense of the other side, and not just negotiating, but also just dealing with another country.
Well, that's a very interesting point. The great concern about foreign service officers is that they go native. Mm. That is, the good thing is they develop a very deep understanding mm-hmm. of this other culture.
Right.
The bad news would be is if they can't nonetheless hang on to what the underlying United States interest might be. But I think the best Foreign Service people do both.
Yeah. So I want to talk to you about the Kissinger book very briefly, because I want to spend the rest of our time on the Jewish American paradox. Kissinger the Negotiator. I've actually been lucky to spend time talking to your co-author Jim Sabanius. We had a conversation a couple months ago about it. But your biggest kind of takeaway from this book, from writing this book, was what? I was told by a friend or mentor really a few days ago. She was giving advice and said, the best way to learn a subject is to write a book about it. What did you learn most from writing that book?
A theme we developed in the book is that Kissinger had a remarkable ability to do what we call, and Jim perhaps talked about this, both zoom out and put a particular negotiation with a particular country in a much broader context of what's going on throughout the world, and broadly what he viewed as the challenges in the world order. On the other hand, he also had a great ability to zoom in, and that is in a particular negotiation. If he were negotiating with you, he would learn a great deal about your background, your culture. He'd be very good at reading you during the negotiation. Many negotiators have one or the other, but they don't have both. And I think that, for example, many of our secretaries of state have not had the breadth of vision that Kissinger did in terms of the world order.
Yeah. Interesting. I mean, this kind of relates. You mentioned that you're not a Jewish studies scholar. You have not spent your life studying religion, and you wrote this book, part memoir, part history, part analysis, cultural commentary. But to me, we're related actually. I mean, you just mentioned Kissinger would study the individual, know where they were coming from. Well, a big part of that to me is people have their interests. If they're negotiating on behalf of a country, they know those countries' interests, but they also have their identities.
That's right.
That feels to me like a really important driver. I mean, we're living in an age of identity, a heightened sense of self-identification. And so it didn't actually feel that strange to me.
Good for you. Well, it's an irony is, when I was working on this project, the title I had in my mind was Negotiating Jewish Identity in Contemporary America. And the publisher, I'm blessed with a wonderful publisher. It's called PublicAffairs. Peter Osnos began the imprint. It's now part of Hachette. But Peter didn't like the title, nor did his marketing colleagues.
Oh, really?
Because he said negotiating identity. People don't negotiate their identities. And in fact, I think people do negotiate.
Well, I think it's a conflict resolution that happens
inside all the time.
Right? Isn't
Absolutely.
You tell a story of Eric Erickson,
exactly,
Madeleine Albright. There's some really good stories in there about how they were negotiating. They were presented with information, or at least in Madeleine Albright's case, but with Eric, a different sort of situation.
I think I'm not an identity essentialist, and that is, I don't think any of us are just one thing. You're not just someone from Kansas City. You're not just a PhD student from the Kennedy School.
Right.
Those things may be aspects of your identity, but there are a lot of other aspects too.
Right.
And I think about my own identity. Some of them relate to roles as a parent, a grandparent, a husband. Some of them relate to professional roles, that I'm interested in dispute resolution, that I'm a law professor. Another strand in my identity is I take pride in my Jewish heritage. These various strands can have different levels of importance for individuals during their life. They're not fixed. And I think one is often negotiating, what's more important to you and why.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, given our age now a person's, particularly for women, their gender is a profoundly important part of their identity. And sexual orientation for many people is a big part of their identity.
It felt to me there were two parts to this. One part was coming to terms with why you felt strongly about your Jewish heritage and Jewish identity, and you kind of came to it, as you say, pretty late in life with the birth of your grandchildren. It was kind of igniting that spark.
I didn't come to it, but that's right. I attached more importance to it. Exactly right.
And the other element of this book is about what the Jewish community in the United States, how they should self-define.
That's right.
What it should mean to be a Reformed Jew.
Or how do you, who should count as Jewish in America?
Right.
I mean, that's a question that
Is that the paradox? What is the paradox exactly?
Okay, there are a couple, but the big paradox is there's never been a nation in the 2,000-year history of the Jewish diaspora, there has never been a nation in which Jews were more accepted, have greater opportunity, and are more integrated into the society than in the United States. It's just stunning on the one hand. Yeah. On the other hand, within the community, there's great anxiety that it's going to all disappear. That except for the ultra-Orthodox, no one else is going to retain their identity. Now, in fact, I think the community does face certain challenges, but I think that diversity and variety of the American Jewish community is something I think is fantastic. I like the diversity and variety, and I think there are challenges that the community faces.
This is not the people being less religious, they're being...
Exactly.
Now, in your solution, which I want to talk about, you mention it's the big tent solution.
Right.
It's like, how does the Jewish American community deal with this issue of all these trends that are happening?
That's right.
Fewer believing in God, fewer participating, and you have this
in the religious life.
In the religious life, excuse me, yes. And you have this as a big tent idea.
That's right.
What is that?
Well, my idea is as follows: that in America, people express their being Jewish in a remarkable range of ways. Some involve, obviously, practicing Judaism as a religion. And for many, that's important and very nourishing. For others, they take great pride in various forms of Jewish philanthropy, in Jewish film festivals, in creating museums to remember the Holocaust, in a variety of activities, many of which may not be explicitly Jewish, but are informed by what they see as their Jewish values. And I think this is terrific too. And my idea of the big tent is, in terms of who should count as a Jew, I think that for the American community as a whole, anyone who wants to self-identify as being Jewish and being part of the enterprise, I say welcome. I don't care who your mother was, whether your mother or your father was Jewish. I don't care whether you've religiously converted.
You don't even care if they believe in God.
I don't care if they believe in God. See, one thing that's, by the way, very paradoxical is I have a chapter about this. I said, well, being Jewish, why shouldn't it require that you're committed to Judaism as a religion?
Right.
And it turns out Judaism has no catechism of required beliefs. I mean, there are beliefs that are at the core of the religion, but nowhere does it say, unlike for Catholicism or Islam, where if you don't believe these things, you can't call yourself a Catholic or an Episcopalian or a Muslim. That's not true in Judaism.
And what's also incredible is you grew up with a Christmas tree.
Yes.
And that's also something that you're...
As a secular.
As a secular, yeah, which I actually, incidentally, so did I. So did my dad, weirdly. He grew up in India.
And was his background Hindu, or?
Yes. So loosely, we were raised very loosely. We went to ceremony, or in holidays once or twice, a couple times a year to the temple, and we had books and things in our about it. But we were.
It was your cultural heritage.
Yes, it was cultural heritage. But we, from ages whatever, I don't know, probably 0, though I don't remember it, until I was maybe 6, 7, we had a Christmas tree. Right. A horrible little thing. I mean, but it was part of just because you get in the mood.
It's the holiday season.
Yeah, holiday season. So that's something also that's changed. What I was interesting was you mentioned that when you were a kid, that was okay as part of the Jewish community to have that culture.
Well, many Reform Jews did. There have always been those within the community, and probably more today than before. I've actually, in the process of writing an op-ed, saying that now that intermarriage is so common in the American Jewish world, since the year 2000, for example, 58% of all Jews who have married non-Jews. Mm-hmm. But it turns out more than half of those, it appears, are raising their children as Jews, even though typically the non-Jewish spouse is not converted. They haven't converted, but nonetheless, they are embracing the ideas that the children should be raised in the Jewish tradition. I think that's fantastic. Many of these households will have a Christmas tree and celebrate both Hanukkah and Christmas. I think that's fine.
Well, this is intensely interesting. And the book, again, is The Jewish American Paradox, Embracing Choice in a Changing World. Bob Mnookin, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. It was great fun.
To view more episodes, please visit our website at snackbreakshow.com.